This is a homily for the 24th Sunday in Ordinary Time. The first reading is from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 50, verses 5 to 9. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. Mark, chapter 8, verses 27 to 35. Let's begin by looking at the setting of today's Gospel. Firstly, where does today's Gospel fit into the overall structure of Mark's Gospel? Secondly, the geographical setting. And thirdly, the theological setting. So firstly, where does today's Gospel fit into the overall structure of Mark's Gospel? As we've seen previously, Mark's Gospel begins with a brief prelude. That is followed by an account of Jesus' ministry in the Galilee region. Jesus and his disciples then begin the journey to Jerusalem for the celebration of Passover. Finally, Mark gives us a day-by-day account of the final week in the life of Jesus, beginning with the day that we now know as Palm or Passion Sunday, and concluding with the women coming to the empty tomb on Easter Sunday morning. In today's Gospel, the ministry in Galilee is at an end, and we reach a decisive milestone. Jesus and the disciples are finally on the way to Jerusalem, the place where Jesus' destiny will be fulfilled in the cross and the resurrection. This journey to Jerusalem is another example of the Markan sandwich, known technically as intercalation. By way of analogy, the two slices of bread in the sandwich are two stories about Jesus healing a blind man, firstly at Bethsaida in chapter 8, and then later at Jericho at the end of chapter 10, just before Jesus and the disciples begin the ascent to Jerusalem. The filling of the sandwich is the story of the journey. More specifically, it is the story of the three prophecies of the Passion and how the disciples react to these prophecies. Speaking of the Markan sandwich, New Testament scholar Tom Wright explains, "The flavour of the outer story adds zest to the inner one. The taste of the inner one is meant in turn to permeate the outer one." Let's change the analogy from a sandwich to a picture frame. Mark frames the story of the journey to Jerusalem with two stories about a blind man being healed. 3 times on this journey, in chapters 8, 9, and 10, Jesus tells the disciples what awaits him in Jerusalem. Let's look briefly at these two miracle stories. Just prior to setting out for the villages round Caesarea Philippi, Jesus heals a blind man at Bethsaida. This is a strange story because the man's sight isn't restored immediately. Jesus leads the man outside the village and, putting spittle on his eyes and laying his hands on him, he asks, "Can you see anything?" The man looks up and replies, "I can see people. They look like trees as they walk around." Since the man's sight is only partially restored, Jesus then lays his hands on the man's eyes a second time, and then he sees clearly. We find the story of this miracle only in Mark's Gospel, and it seems to be the evangelist's commentary on the disciples. They see, but they don't see. They fail to understand. They are spiritually blind and forgetful, despite all that they have seen Jesus do. The second healing of a blind man takes place as Jesus and the disciples are leaving Jericho, about to begin the ascent to Jerusalem. This is the gospel that we'll hear on the 30th Sunday in Ordinary Time. Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, is sitting by the side of the road. He cries out, "Son of David, Jesus, have mercy on me." Jesus asks him, "What do you want me to do for you?" He replies, "Rabboni, let me see again." Jesus then says, "Go, your faith has saved you." Then we're told he could see again, and he followed Jesus along the road. The Greek word translated here as road is hodos. The Greek word hodos can be translated as road, way, or path, but more often than not in Mark's Gospel it refers to the way of discipleship. The geographical setting becomes a theological setting. These two miracles frame the journey to Jerusalem. More specifically, they frame the three predictions of the Passion in chapters 8, 9 and 10. We hear the first of these three predictions of the Passion in today's Gospel, so we'll come to that in a moment. Next Sunday, we'll be reflecting upon the second of these three predictions of the Passion. Let's now turn to the geographical setting of today's Gospel. As we've already seen, Jesus heals a blind man at Bethsaida. Jesus and the disciples then leave for the villages round Caesarea Philippi. As you can see from the map on the right, the journey by car today from Bethsaida to Caesarea Philippi takes about 45 minutes. It's a distance of about 52 kilometres. The geographical setting of today's Gospel is somewhere on the way to the villages round Caesarea Philippi. Note that Mark tells us that Jesus and the disciples are en te hodo, literally on the way. Another reminder that in Mark's Gospel we're talking about the way of discipleship. The Greek word translated here as villages is komos. It refers to the small settlements surrounding the larger city. We'd probably call them suburbs. The setting for this episode in Matthew's Gospel is the region of Caesarea Philippi. There's no mention of Caesarea Philippi in Luke's account of this episode. We're not told whether Jesus and the disciples actually reach Caesarea Philippi, but it would seem as though it's an important backdrop for this story in the Gospels of Mark and Matthew. So, let's have a look at Caesarea Philippi. Here you can see a map of Herod the Great's kingdom. Herod the Great died in 4 BC. On this map, Caesarea Philippi is named Panias. Panias was named after the Greek god Pan. You might also see it named as Banias, which is an Arabic corruption of the name Panias. In 20 BC, the Roman Emperor Augustus gave the district of Panias to Herod the Great. Herod ruled as king of Judea from 37 BC until 4 BC, subject, of course, to the authority of Rome. And so Herod renamed the town Caesarea in honour of Augustus. As an expression of his gratitude, he also built a magnificent marble temple in 19 BC in honour of the emperor. The temple was known as the Augusteum. Herod died in 4 BC, and following his death his kingdom was divided into 4. At the time of Jesus, Judea was under the direct rule of Rome, and Pontius Pilate was the procurator from about 27 AD to 37 AD. Herod's son, also named Herod, was Tetrarch of Galilee. The word tetrarch means the ruler of a quarter. It was this Herod, known as Herod Antipas, who ordered the execution of John the Baptist. Philip, another of Herod's sons, was Tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis. He ruled from 4 BC until his death in 41 AD. And Licinius was Tetrarch of Abilene. You'll notice that Caesarea Philippi is within the Tetrarchy of Philip. Philip developed the city and resided there. He struck coins with images of its buildings, and you'll see one of those coins in a moment. The city was generally known as Caesarea Philippi, that is, Caesarea of Philip, to distinguish it from the better-known Caesarea by the sea, or Caesarea Maritima. You can see some of the ruins of ancient Caesarea Philippi in these photographs. I've said that the town took its name Panias from the nature god Pan, and that is because the cave that you can see in this photograph was a grotto where Pan was worshipped from at least the 3rd century BC. I took this photo of the cave or grotto during the last pilgrimage that I led to the Holy Land. The Jewish writer Josephus had this to say about the cave. It is prodigiously deep and full of still water. Over it hangs a vast mountain, and under the cavern arise the springs of the river Jordan. Josephus was writing at the same time that the Gospels were being written. Here you can see the site of the Augustaeum today. As you can see, virtually nothing remains of the temple except some of the foundation stones. This gives you an idea of what the site would have looked like at the time of Jesus. Here you can see the Augustaeum, the marble temple built by Herod the Great in 19 BC to honour the Emperor Augustus. Augustus died in 14 AD. Behind the Augustaeum is the grotto associated with the god Pan. The other temple, dedicated to Zeus, was built during the reign of the Roman Emperor Trajan. He was emperor from 98 AD until 117 AD. So the temple dedicated to Zeus was not there at the time of Jesus. Here you can see where the Augustaeum once stood in relation to the site as it is today. This coin, dating from 31 AD, shows the Augustaeum on one side and the image of the emperor on the other side. The geographical setting of today's Gospel brings us to the theological setting. Against this backdrop of Caesarea Philippi, a city associated with imperial power, a city where there was a temple dedicated to the Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus, Jesus asks his disciples a question. Who do people say I am? Before we consider how the disciples respond, let me pose this question. Who am I talking about when I describe a certain person as divinely conceived, Son of God, Kurios, Lord, Saviour, bringer of peace, bringer of good news? A Christian living in the 21st century would immediately respond, you're obviously talking about Jesus Christ. However, that's not the answer a person living in the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD would have given. They would have replied, "You're obviously talking about the Roman emperor." It was said of Caesar Augustus that he was conceived by the god Apollo in the womb of his mother Atia. The emperor was given titles such as Son of God, Lord, Saviour of the world, Bringer of peace on earth, and Bringer of good news. And these titles were to be found on coins, in temples, and on public monuments. Here, for example, is a coin from the time of the Emperor Tiberius, the adopted son of Augustus. On one side we have the Latin words Tiberius Caesar, Divi Augusti Filius Augustus. That translates as Tiberius Caesar, august son of the divine Augustus. On the reverse side we have the two words Pontifex Maximus, which means high priest. Against the backdrop of Caesarea Philippi, Mark's Gospel is subtly asking the question, who is Kurios? Who is Lord? Do we proclaim Kaiser Kurios or Jesus Kurios? Is Caesar Lord or is Jesus Lord? I could pose the question another way. Who or what do I worship? I'm using the word worship here in the sense of ascribing worth to. I may reply that I worship God, but in reality, where do I invest my time, talents, money, energy, emotions, and enthusiasm? The Bible uses the word idolatry whenever we ascribe ultimate worth to anything or anyone but God alone. It is idolatry because we are ascribing ultimate worth to something or someone that is quite obviously created and finite rather than to the infinite Creator. So let's come back to the question, where in reality do I invest my time, talents, money, energy, thought, emotions, and enthusiasm? To my family, to my job, to study, to keeping fit, to looking after my pet dog, to social media, to partying, to household chores, to watching television, to eating, to holidays, to looking after the grandchildren, to playing sport, to commuting, to discipleship. All of these are important aspects of our lives, but there's something radically wrong with the arrangement that you can see here. Discipleship appears to be just one compartment in a very busy life, and something that can be easily discarded if you don't have the time or the energy. This is not what the Christian life looks like. The Christian life should look something like this. Here, Jesus is at the very centre of our lives. Everything else that we do in life flows from our relationship with the Lord. And everything that we do is done ultimately for the Lord. He alone is the one to whom we ascribe ultimate worth. So, against the backdrop of Caesarea Philippi, Jesus asks the disciples, "Who do people say I am?" They reply, "John the Baptist," others, "Elijah," others again, "one of the prophets." Pope Benedict offers this reflection on this response. These various opinions are not simply mistaken, they are greater or lesser approximations to the mystery of Jesus, and they can certainly set us on the path towards Jesus' real identity, but they do not arrive at Jesus' identity at his newness. They interpret him in terms of the past, in terms of the predictable and the possible, not in terms of himself, his uniqueness, which cannot be assigned to any other category. Jesus then asks the disciples, "But who do you say I am?" Before hearing how the disciples respond to that question, I think we all need to ask ourselves, how do I respond to this question? The English Benedictine monk, Father Lawrence Freeman, offers us this reflection. Who do you say I am is an intimately personal question. If we do not feel its intimacy as disturbing, even intrusive, we have not listened to it. It is a question that summons a response from a silent depth within the heart itself. Peter replies, "You are the Christ." So, what does the word Christ mean? The word Christ is Christos in the Greek and Meshiach, or Messiah, in the Hebrew. It is not a name but a title. It means the Anointed One. It is a title applied to Jesus 529 times in the New Testament. But what would a first-century Palestinian Jew have understood by the term Christos or Meshiach? The term Anointed One referred especially to the king. The king was God's Anointed One. Under King David and his son Solomon, the 12 tribes of Israel were united as a single nation. But in the 1,000 years between the time of David and Jesus, the Jewish people had been conquered by one superpower after another. Following the death of King Solomon, the United Kingdom once again divided along tribal lines. The northern kingdom of Israel had Samaria as its capital, and the southern kingdom of Judah had Jerusalem as its capital. The Assyrians in the 8th century wiped out the northern kingdom of Israel. The Babylonians in the 6th century conquered the southern kingdom of Judah, destroying the temple and taking thousands of captives into exile in Babylon. Then came the Persians. The Persians actively encouraged ethnic and religious groups within their empire to maintain their own institutions and traditions. The Persians were conquered by Alexander the Great. Alexander's conquest of Judea in 332 BC had profound and far-reaching effects on Jewish history. Alexander was fully committed to disseminating the Greek way of life throughout his empire, Greek institutions, language, thought, and culture. This process came to be known as Hellenization. Following the death of Alexander in 323 BC, his vast empire was divided among his generals. Israel was at first part of the Ptolemaic Empire, which was based in Egypt, and then part of the Seleucid Empire, which was based in Syria. In the 2nd century BC, the Jews revolted against the heavy hand of the Seleucid king Antiochus IV. For a brief period under the Hasmoneans, the Jews enjoyed a degree of freedom and autonomy. Finally, in 63 BC, Pompey conquered Jerusalem. you can understand how the people of Israel looked back to the time of David as a golden age and prayed that God would send them another anointed one, a son of David, someone who could liberate them from the tyranny of foreign overlords. If only we could once again be a free people in our own land. Such longings are expressed in the Psalms of Solomon, a collection of 18 psalms written a few years before the birth of Jesus. They are not included in the Scriptures, but they speak of David's kingship over Israel and pray for a new king, a son of David, another anointed one. And so we read, "Raise up for them their king, the son of David, to destroy the unrighteous rulers, to purge Jerusalem from Gentiles. He will have Gentile nations serving under his yoke. He will be a righteous king, the Lord Messiah." So, a popular understanding of the Messiah was a David-like figure who would rid the country of foreign rulers, such as the Romans, and cleanse the land of paganism. Jesus makes it quite clear that he is not going to be the kind of Messiah the Psalms of Solomon were yearning for. And so he tells his disciples quite openly that the Son of Man was destined to suffer grievously, to be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and to be put to death, and after 3 days to rise again. This brings us to today's first reading from the prophet Isaiah. Keep in mind that the first reading in the Sunday lectionary is chosen to complement the theme of the Gospel. There is a scholarly consensus that the book of Isaiah, as we now have it, was written over several centuries and by at least 3 different authors. The prophet Isaiah, the son of Amos, lived in Jerusalem during the last half of the 8th century BC. His prophecies are deeply rooted in his own time and place, and many of them address current events in his own day. Only rarely does he tell us what these events are, but his audience, of course, would have known immediately, since they were living through them as well. Scholars attribute chapters 1 to 39 to the prophet Isaiah. Chapters 40 to 55 are written by an anonymous prophet who lived in the 6th century BC during the Babylonian exile. Biblical scholars refer to him as Second Isaiah. He wrote towards the end of the Babylonian exile. Since Babylon was defeated by the Persian king Cyrus in 539 BC, that gives us some indication of when Second Isaiah was written. Chapters 56 to 66 are also written by an anonymous prophet, whom scholars call Third Isaiah. These chapters are set in the land of Israel shortly after the end of the exile, so roughly late in the 6th century BC, after the temple had been rebuilt in 515 BC. Our first reading today comes from 2nd Isaiah. These chapters contain a set of what are known as servant songs. In these servant songs, redemption and victory are promised to a suffering servant of the Lord. Today's first reading is the third of these so-called servant songs. Jewish biblical scholar Christine Hayes says this about the servant songs. The identity of the servant in these passages has been a puzzle to biblical interpreters for centuries, especially because the servant is, at times, a collective figure, and at times an individual figure. In chapter 49, the servant is described as a prophet, but with a universal message rather than a message for the Israelites alone. The servant, or prophet, is first identified as Israel herself. Yet in chapter 49, verse 5, it would appear that the prophet, servant, has a mission to Israel to bring her back to Yahweh, and therefore is not to be identified with Israel. It is easy to see how the early Christians saw their Lord in this mysterious figure, a suffering servant of God. However, even though the lectionary has chosen this third servant song to complement today's gospel, we find few echoes of the servant songs in the Gospel of Mark. Let's now return to today's gospel. Jesus begins to teach the disciples that the Son of Man has to suffer much, to be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and to be put to death, and after 3 days to rise again. And how do the disciples react? Mark tells us that Peter began to rebuke him. The idea of a Messiah who is going to suffer and die is beyond Peter's comprehension. New Testament scholar Joel Marcus reminds us that we will never understand this passage rightly if we do not realize how natural Peter's reaction is. One idea that does not seem to be prominent in pre-Christian Judaism is that of the suffering Messiah. No early Jewish text speaks of such a figure. To Christians, the idea of a suffering Messiah seems natural, but that is because it is so deeply rooted in a Christian understanding of the Old Testament. In Judaism, however, the Davidic Messiah is associated with triumph, not defeat and death. Peter's shocked reaction is, therefore, realistic. Jesus, however, rebukes Peter with strong and harsh words. "Get behind me, Satan. You are thinking not as God thinks, but as humans do." The Hebrew word Satan means something like adversary or opponent. Peter has, at least temporarily, become a Satan because he is opposing the will of God. Let's return for a moment to Jesus' cure of the blind man at Bethsaida. His sight at first is only partially restored. And so when Peter confesses that Jesus is the Christ, he is only partially correct. His eyes are not fully open to the truth about Jesus. New Testament scholar Francis Maloney explains, "There is a deeper mystery to the messianic status of Jesus of Nazareth, whom the disciples are following. They are yet to come to full sight, matching the final experience of the blind man, seeing everything clearly. After commanding them to silence, he immediately broaches that deeper mystery, announcing in the first prediction of his forthcoming passion that the Messiah is the Son of Man who must go up to Jerusalem to be slain and to rise from the dead." The kingdom, the rule, or the reign of God is therefore counterintuitive. It is contrary to the strategies employed by the powers of this world. God's reign will challenge and overturn all normal human assumptions about power and glory, about what is really important in life and in the world. The lesson that the disciples have not yet learned is that discipleship isn't about what's in it for me. It is about taking up a cross and following Jesus. As Jesus puts it in today's gospel, anyone who wants to save his life will lose it, but anyone who loses his life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it.